I won fork a few years ago on a jerkbait. You've probably seen maybe on the Elite Series at Murray, I did really well on jerkbait, but I threw a jerkbait a ton on shad spawn stuff. And when it comes to like, shad spawn herring fishing, the jerkbait is more hitting the bottom then. Like that's a post spawn kind of reaction type bite. So the actual like action of the jerkbait doesn't make a huge difference. So kind of want to run down like the different jerkbaits I carry in the boat. We're not talking brands or types or anything like that, just kind of the sizes and how I set them up, rod, line, things like that, to get the best performance out of a jerkbait. I'll talk about, my kind of shad spawn type fishing, my post spawn jerkbait, kind of tell you about a little bit like pre-spawn cold water and when I throw different jerkbaits versus, the deep diving, shallow diving, big, small, things like that. I want to run down kind of my setups and the sizes I use for certain things. Your traditional jerkbait, what I would say almost everybody throws and probably is my main jerkbait is like a 110 size. There's this typical like 3-hook. This is called a 110 because it's 110 millimeters, but this is your traditional size jerkbait. And this is a size jerkbait that I would throw 70% of jerkbait fishing time. I'm gonna throw it majority of the time, but there's a lot of things you can do with this size jerkbait to basically make it multiple baits in one. So first of all, we'll talk about like, I mentioned shad spawn. So when I'm throwing it up shallow, when I'm throwing a jerkbait up shallow, with fish feeding or post spawn type fish, I'm gonna use heavier line. I'm gonna use like minimum of probably 15-pound test. So what that does is it keeps the bait from going too deep and it doesn't matter. You don't need light line. It gets frayed up on the bottom on rocks or anything. Doesn't matter because you got 15-pound test. So I'm gonna use heavier line, still use a Century, my jerkbait rod. It's designed for a jerkbait and a gravity reel, but I use heavier line for that type of fishing with this size jerkbait. But what's cool with this jerkbait, this size, is you can vary your line, especially with just the traditional, most 110 size jerkbaits dive, say 4 to 6 feet. Well, you can actually, with that 15, it's gonna be like 3 feet. If you go down or like less in line to like a 10, it'll get 6 to 7 feet. So you can take the same bait and just vary your line size, get it a lot deeper, keep it a lot shallower, but the bigger line also generally dulls down the action. It doesn't do the darting as much as it normally would. It's more of a duller, like just kind of forwards, but a lot of times when I'm throwing the really heavy line, I'm doing the heavy line on purpose because I don't care about that, whether it's hitting the bottom or I want it to not do much. So when it comes to this, so live scope has really showed me a lot with jerkbait fishing. Is I've learned the way the fish react to a jerkbait is a jerkbait's one of those weird baits because you throw a crankbait, you throw a jig, you feel that bait like, boom, 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 bouncing across the bottom. You feel it come over a tree. And you have that bait in the strike zone. Well, what's weird with the jerkbait is you're not. You're just jerking it. It's in the middle of the water column. You're not feeling much. So, but what I've learned with live scope is majority of fish, especially in cold water, that's what we're talking is like, which is traditional jerkbait fishing, cold water, they really want to come up to get that bait. If it gets down too deep, they really don't like to eat it. Like if you're throwing this jerkbait in 5 foot, you really want to kind of up that line size, maybe jerk your rod up and keep that bait up, suspended in the water column like it's supposed to be. Because a cold water fish, now we're not talking shad spawn or anything like that, a cold water fish really doesn't like to feed down on a jerkbait. They like to run up to it, and if it gets below them, they don't really want to go down and eat it. They want to come up and grab it. So you got to vary your line size, and this is the traditional size I'm going to use in that situation to keep it in the right depth, Century rod, and vary my line. The other jerkbait that I would say I do not throw this quite as much, but is like a 110 like deep diver jerkbait. This is just like, it's just got a bigger bill. It's designed to go 8 to 12 feet, generally 6 to 12. And I always pretty much, if I'm throwing this deeper jerkbait, it can be used to, like if you're deflecting it off brush or something, you can not worry about maybe the diving depth. You just use that bigger bill to keep it deflecting. But generally I'm throwing it when I want to get deeper. So I'm usually throwing it on light line, 12 pound or less, 10, 12. And you can actually change the hooks. You can weight the hooks. You can do whatever you want to get that bait to even go deeper or even sink ever so slightly. You never want it to just fall, sink, but you can weight these, change the hooks on a +1 style. You've seen it play in a lot of tournaments over the years, but I'd like to throw the bigger bill when I want to get deeper, and I always throw it still on the Century rod still with, you know, the same gravity reel, but I use almost always exclusively lighter line on this bait, because the reason I'm throwing the +1 is to get it deeper. You know, I can get this bait down. I can get a deeper diving jerkbait down much, much deeper on 10-pound test than I can 15, and then you put some bigger hooks, it'll really, really get down there. I really like the larger baits. So the larger jerkbaits, I've been using these in like big fish scenarios. So we're talking 130 plus size jerkbaits, which is 130 millimeters. They're a good bit bigger than that, you know, 110, which is traditional size. But I feel like a Magnum jerkbait, you've seen it play. You've probably seen it on the Elite Series on live a lot. The bigger jerkbaits are really, really productive in some situations. And over my experience playing with it, it seems like it's obviously really good on big fish lakes. Like, you know, you're talking Lake Fork or something like that. The bigger jerkbait's good because you're fishing for big fish, and it's always good for that. But also, I've noticed it has a lot more drawing power than small jerkbaits. So even if you're not getting them to eat it, a fish will come from a lot deeper to eat that larger profile bait than they will, you know, the smaller, like the 110 size or even smaller than that. But one thing I change up as far as setup on these bigger jerkbaits is I got the Century designed for a jerkbait, but it feels overpowered with the, you know, larger, the heavier, the bigger jerkbaits. So when I'm throwing Magnum jerkbaits, I use my 1 more. It's the 7.2 medium. It's still softer action, good for treble hooks, but it's a bigger rod. Handle those bigger baits, take up more line when you jerk it, and I can throw the bait a lot farther. It just, the Century feels overpowered. Even though it's a jerkbait rod, it's not a good big jerkbait rod. When it comes to line, I pretty much never throw less than 15-pound test on these bigger jerkbaits. 14, 15-pound test, you know, slightly bigger line sizes, because what'll end up happening, done it a lot, you get your hooks wrapped around your line a few times. If you're using 10 or 12-pound test with a heavy jerkbait, you're gonna break your line and fling your jerkbait off into the lake. Generally, jerkbaits are not cheap baits. You don't wanna do that. So bigger jerkbaits, I would say heavier line. So the right setup for the right jerkbait makes them all perform a lot better. And one thing I didn't really realize till I was able to see the baits on live scope, things like that, is how much differently a bait acts with different setups, different hooks, different line, things like that. And actually a jerkbait's one style of bait, but really the variety of jerkbaits out there is a bunch of different baits in one. You can do a lot of things with them. They're super versatile bait. But so I recommend playing with them with different lines, different rods, things like that to get different actions on them.